So my name is Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and I'm going to tell you the truth about protein. And really, my underlying objective is for you to walk away with a good understanding of what muscle-centric medicine is. And muscle-centric medicine and protein are very intimately tied. Okay, before we talk about protein and before we talk about muscle-centric medicine, we really have to discuss the current conversation. What is the current atmosphere of what's happening in nutritional sciences? Well, it's kind of like the mouse with the microphone. You have the vegans, the vegetarians, fruitarian, breatharian, pick your poison. Small group with a really loud mouth. You also have PETA, Big Pharma, Kellogg's, General Mills, American Heart Association, all paid industry, okay? So there's a lot of big money, like Impossible Burger. These are companies that have a lot, millions and millions of dollars behind them, okay? So this is one group, and it's the group that I like to call the mouse with the microphone. And then on the other hand, you have farmers, you have the dairy board, beef, and egg. Very tightly regulated by a small group, regulated by the USDA. They're very limited in what they can say, and that's why you don't hear them very often. So that's why it's so skewed in the media. It's really based on the governing bodies and who is allowed to say what. So you have processed foods and you have small groups with massive agendas with very loud mouths. And then you have industry like egg and beef and dairy who are really not allowed to say much because they are not privately funded and are overseen by the government. All right, so you guys got that. So now we talked about the conversation around nutritional science, really that atmosphere, but what about the current state of our health? Well, it's abysmal, right? We've got obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, the diseases of aging. They all have one thing in common. They're not separate. They have an underlying metabolic impairment, and that's really the pathology. Okay. Just to make matters a little bit worse for you, I want to highlight one more thing. So we talked about obesity. Well, we kind of highlighted obesity, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, really as it relates to one metabolic impairment, and really it's about the muscle tissue. I want to highlight the brain and really what's happened because muscle tissue actually relates to brain tissue. As our BMIs increase, so as we get fatter, our brain volume decreases. So as our waistline increases, our executive function, decision-making, planning, organization, and intention all decrease. All right, so what has actually happened through the years? Well, as you can see from the chickens have really gotten big. From 1957 to 2005, we've had a massive expansion in the waistline of chickens. Interestingly, we've also had the massive expansion of waistline in humans. So the average American's man's waistline has expanded 1 inch. The average American woman's waistline, 1.5 inches. Really, ladies, we have excelled. And this is so interesting because the chickens, just like if you think about it, everything has gotten better. So the chickens from 1957, if we saw a 1957 chicken, we would think that thing was sickly. Probably no one would want to eat it. So just the awareness and the expansion of our waistline is really kind of an indication of what's happened. Everything has gotten supersized. All right. Now, I want you all to listen in, and if you take one thing away from this module, this is what it's going to be. Everything you know about obesity, everything you've been taught, everything that you've been thinking about the current paradigm of thinking is wrong, okay? It's wrong. We are not over fat. Everybody focuses on obesity. They focus on body fat, really losing weight, and really that this is the problem. This is a symptom of the problem, which is why we haven't really been able to treat it. It is not an issue of being over fat, okay? It is an issue of being under muscled. Defects in the muscle begin first. Before you put on weight, before you have high blood sugar, before you have high lipids, before you have any other metabolic dysregulation, it truly begins in the muscle tissue first, because muscle is the organ of longevity. And this is really shifting the paradigm of thinking. Okay, so what do we know about muscle? Well, we know it's not just about looking good in a bikini or a mankini. Muscle is truly the largest endocrine organ in the body. And when you contract muscle, it secretes things. And one of those things, it secretes arbitrary things, is actually a myokine. And a myokine is specifically secreted from muscle and travels throughout the body and has different effects on the tissue. So for example, this muscle tissue here, this skeletal muscle tissue here is shown secreting interleukin 6. And interleukin 6 is effective in fat oxidation. So it plays a role in fat oxidation. Also plays a role, interleukin 6 plays a role in glucose uptake. So it's, it has numerous roles here, and there's really too many to go into, but this just gives you a picture of muscle as an endocrine organ, so much more than looking good in a bikini. And it really plays a role in nutrient partitioning, which we're going to get to. Okay, this is really the big one and the most popular myokine, and it's interleukin 6. It is anti-inflammatory when contracted from secreting muscle. But it is inflammatory when it's released from macrophages. Okay, so what else is muscle? Muscle as it's a metabolic sink, right? It's the largest endocrine organ on one hand, but it's also your metabolic currency. And here's why. It is responsible for 80% of glucose disposal, insulin-related glucose disposal. Lipid oxidation, really important. Everybody talks about cholesterol and statins. Well, what if I told you that muscle is one of the largest sites for lipid oxidation? You might rethink your statin and consider doing some resistance training. I mean, I'm just saying. Plays a huge role as an amino acid reservoir. In fact, it's really the only place that we store amino acids. And that's why when you see in cancer and cachexia, which is that wasting of the body, and we've all seen that, or if you've seen an elderly person really become skinny and, God forbid they have some kind of injury or issue or hospitalization, they count on their muscle mass. So muscle mass is directly related to survivability. It's also the large site for branched chain amino acid metabolism. Okay, so this is really highlighting that muscle is your metabolic sink. And branched chain amino acid metabolism is really important for utilization of fuel. Okay, so let's talk about muscle tissue and really what are your options? So we talked about the underlying pathology is really metabolic dysregulation. So you've got obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's. And I told you it's not really about being over fat, it's really about being under muscled. So muscle as an endocrine organ and muscle is something that secretes myokines is so vital for your health. So when you're young, you got pretty good looking muscle, right? It doesn't look like a marbled steak, right? Healthy. But then as you age, and here I have two pictures of aging tissue, right? The one on the right here, this is a 66-year-old man, and this shows his average steps and his average activity, his METs per day, how much training he's doing. And you can see his tissue looks much more similar to a youthful tissue. So you do have some fat infiltration, but it's not nearly as significant as this poor guy who is 66 years old with body fat mass, you can see below here, 81 kilograms, fat mass. And his average steps are 3,000. And really what this is highlighting is the change in tissue. So as you age, that metabolic organ ages as well in a way where you begin to infiltrate fat and the quality of the tissue decreases. Okay. So these changes with age, what actually happens? Well, there's numerous things that happen. And really one of the things at the core of aging that I'm going to highlight here today, just one aspect, is this change in signaling. And this signaling is mTOR. And mTOR is mechanistic target of rapamycin. And it's really a nutrient sensor, which allows for sensing amino acids, and then generating this signal that allows for muscle protein synthesis. Okay, so this actual signaling process changes as you age. There's a couple other things that change. And it ain't gonna be fun. Listen, I hear aging is not for the faint of heart. So sex hormones decrease, insulin resistance increases, capillary perfusion decreases, which is simply the blood flow to organ tissues decrease, protein signaling, and the reason I highlight this is where mTOR comes in, is the one that you can change. So it's all nice and good if there's these nebulous things that you can't really change, but protein signaling we can change, and quite simply, we can change it through nutrition. Also, muscle and metabolic changes really change with age, and I will come back to this RDA. So essentially, training and eating the way that you did in your youth, in your 20s, is totally detrimental, right? So here we picked 30 years old, you have a decrease in growth hormone and decrease in testosterone, and then also those other nutrient sensing decrease, insulin resistance, increasing capillary perfusion. All of this changes your ability to get the correct signaling to maintain that tissue, which is muscle mass, skeletal muscle. All right, that was fancy. Okay, so muscle signaling, let's talk about it. Muscle is the organ of longevity. Issues with the tissue happen before any of the subsequent illnesses. When you're young, your hormones, you're driven by hormones, right? You can pretty much eat a Twinkie diet and do great. However, as you age, this is where nutrition becomes non-negotiable. You have to change your nutrient dosing as you age, otherwise you do not have a chance to get that signaling back. So when you're young, you are really driven by hormones, testosterone, growth hormone. But as you age, you then become reliant on insulin, which is okay, and leucine, which would be much greater, much more important to stimulate your tissue with, muscle tissue in particular, because leucine is one of the branched chain amino acids from protein, versus insulin. We all know where insulin comes from, excess carbohydrates. So some of my more advanced people listening are probably saying, oh, well, protein also stimulates insulin. It does, but it just stimulates a phase 1 response. And I'll talk about that at some other lectures, but just please keep in mind that the insulin stimulation from protein is different in its robustness and its phase response versus carbohydrates. So basically, when you're young, you're driven by hormones. When you age, you really are now going to be driven by activity and protein. And of that protein, it's really about leucine to stimulate this mTOR. Okay, so this is my dad. Thought you guys would like to see my dad. This is Nate Dog. He lives in Ecuador. And really, the truth about protein is you gotta change the amounts if you wanna age well. And aging can start in your 30s. So you have to adapt to your changing hormonal milieu. Otherwise, you're gonna be like that marbled steak picture that I showed you, okay? What does this mean for you? So this is this is from Doug Patton Jones's lab, and he's great if you guys are interested in learning more about bed rest or what happens when you detrain. And this is really interesting. So this shows you the trajectory of an untrained individual. So over here is the muscle area versus age. So interestingly, if you train throughout life, which my dad does, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him, you can maintain your muscle tissue. And again, muscle is not just looking good in a bikini. It's your metabolic organ. It's going to protect you and your survival, right? And it's responsible for your metabolic currency. So versus an untrained individual, let's say an untrained individual then gets COVID, or an untrained individual then gets an injury. Their trajectory, their muscle mass loss is incredibly significant. And their ability to recover, so you can see this is not a slow, steady progression. This is very sharp decline. And, you know, when I was in my fellowship in geriatrics taking care of patients, I saw this, and this was deadly. So the inability to train and adapt is, it's lethal. So anyway, back to my dad, no more depressing stories. So Nate Dogg over here, he eats, how does he protect his tissues? So he eats 130 to 150 grams of high quality protein per day. Yep, sure does. He distributes that into 3 meals. So that can easily be 50 grams per meal of dietary protein, high quality animal-based protein. And he resistance trains 3 days a week. He only takes transportation if it's less than 3 hours by foot. And he did listen to his daughter for once. I have totally changed his diet. He was really big into fasting. As you age, fasting is not your friend. You have to protect the primary tissue at all costs, okay? All right, so now you guys all wanna know, how are you gonna alter this course? What is the real truth about protein, and what are we gonna do to optimize this organ of longevity? Well, you're gonna have optimal dietary protein, and you're going to resistance train. You know, again, the elephant in the room is protein. So protein is the black sheep of the macronutrient family. Everybody has something to say about it. It's very emotional for people. It has a face. That face and that emotion has totally skewed the science, and it's been completely deadly for individuals. I mean, I can't even tell you the other healthcare professionals what I hear them say, because they're uneducated in this and they're believing the mouse with the microphone. So I just want to go on record of saying that plant protein is not the same as animal protein, and these are hard, fast biological numbers, and we can talk about it. It's just the way that it is. And you know, I'll just highlight this: an 8-ounce steak is about 1.8 ounces of protein with only 0.27 ounces of usable protein. This is what they're saying. Totally not true, right? An 8-ounce steak has 8 ounces of usable protein. And these are the kind of things that you're seeing, right? But then they say products like spirulina and rice protein, which are biologically insufficient. Somewhere along the lines, they make claims that it's 5 ounces of usable protein for 8 ounces consumed. So it's total BS. The reality is, and I'll show you later on in the slide, it takes 6 cups of quinoa to equal 1 small chicken breast. And this is based on the amino acid profile. Do not be fooled. It's all BS, truly. Animal proteins make the right amino acid in the right doses. For humans, like feeds like. Muscle tissue feeds muscle tissue. Plants make the right amount of amino acids for plants, period. All right, so, you know, we really screwed up in the past. And so it's no surprise that we'd screw up again. They originally, we talked about the food guide pyramid, which said avoid fats, eat grains, you know, and you can see the servings there. That was a mistake, right? Made everyone fat and diabetic. Then they've now moved to My Plate, which does seem to be a little bit more balanced as it relates to protein and vegetables. Okay, so at least you've increased your protein. But I would argue that we have all the current recommendations wrong. And I believe that in the next 7 years, you will see that we are going to become much more protein centric. I just want to remind you what happened. So from the 1970s to 2000s, we haven't had any change. We've had no improvement, heart disease or cancer, but everybody blames protein, you know, but actually nothing has changed. And we have new things emerging based on what we're eating, and we have more sarcopenia and more dyslipidemia. So I would argue and say that the new diseases are protein related. And the fact is we just don't have that number right. Okay. You know, so as it relates to the truth about protein, we've got it all wrong. And, you know, the hard, fast science is there. It's been there for over 30 years. But what's happened is you've got policy in play, so you actually don't get the real information. And I just want to highlight how outrageous this is. So over here, you have calories, 220 calories. This is just a sample of a nutrition guideline or a nutrition food label. And you've got 12 grams of fat, okay? And then you go to saturated fat, trans fats, cholesterol, sodium, carbohydrates, you know, breaks down carbohydrates nice, sweetly. And then you've got protein. And it just says protein. But there are various levels of amino acids, which different qualities with different qualities, and there's no discussion of that. This is a complete mistake. Okay, what is protein? Well, proteins are amino acids. You have the essential and the non-essential. Just like carbohydrates, proteins have different profiles, right? So a Twinkie profile is different than a blueberry profile. Well, a quinoa profile is different than a beef profile. And really what determines the quality of the the quality of the protein is the amino acids. And those are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Those are the branch chain amino acids. And really you can see them here. They are the limiting amino acids. And then of course, lysine, methionine, tryptophan, threonine, leucine, but really what we're gonna focus on is these ones. So these are necessary for stimulating muscle tissue. So we're not really eating for protein, we're eating for amino acids. Okay, so now I thought it was important, I am evidence-based, and this is some of the current protein guidelines, which I believe that they will change. So you can learn it and then throw it out of your mind, because I think that it is inadequate and the science is beginning to demonstrate that that is true. So the first year of life is 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein, and that's really determined on growth. And I believe that we're probably closer to that. So, you know, my recommendation is 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. That is higher than what's supported in the literature. The literature would say 1 gram per pound lean body mass, but most people don't know their lean body mass. And you're not gonna go wrong with too much protein. There's no evidence to support that that is negative in any way. So basically these current protein guidelines have not changed in a very long time. And they still recommend 0.8 grams per kilogram. This is old, this has not changed. And it's really based on the RDA and minimum level for what they considered what's called a positive nitrogen balance, which is not considered helpful anymore. And it's the minimum amount to maintain body weight. And really when they determined what these guidelines would be, it was pretty arbitrary. First, they decided on fat, and that was, you know, Ansel Keys doing, and then American Heart Association. So they decided on how much fat you were gonna get. Then they decided on carbohydrates. And whatever was left over, they defaulted to protein. Not very effective. Okay, so the safe ranges of dietary protein, really, it's all safe. I would say the safety becomes when you have too little. A dietary recommendation could be 0.8 grams, great, up to 3 grams per kilogram, right? And it could be between 10% of energy and 35% of energy. I think we really need to streamline it. You know, it really should be closer to 1 gram per pound body weight, and at a minimum of 30 grams per meal, period, minimum. Okay, so, you know, the evidence is there, no matter what you're hearing in the media. You know, there's a lot of variations between what you should. If you hear the vegan vegetarian groups, they'll tell you you need a minimal amount of protein. But if you actually look at the literature, the role of protein in weight loss and weight maintenance is decades old. So here are some studies. It preserves lean muscle mass, which I told you is the organ of longevity. A group of experts here, evidence-based recommendations for optimal protein, for optimal dietary protein intake in older people. This is the ProDage study group. Use this in my fellowship. You know, please understand that protein is the most important macronutrient. And listen, that being said, do I think fat's important? Yes. Do we need carbohydrates? No. I am of the school of thought that optimal protein is the way to go to maintain weight as well as muscle tissue as you age. Okay. So again, here's my cute little thing. What do they all have in common? Well, they all have higher protein. So what are some of the metabolic advantages of protein? It's not just about, you know, satiation. So protein is very satiety producing, but it does numerous other things. And it's really because of the amino acids. It improves body composition. and it protects skeletal muscle, which is what is so important to me as a trained geriatrician and someone who is trained in obesity medicine. It increases metabolic rate, and that's, you know, as you eat it, it's really through this thermal effect of feeding. It enhances satiety. So if someone has a binge eating disorder or an issue with overeating, the ability to enhance satiety is very helpful in taking them and moving them off the X of bad behavior. But interestingly, it helps reverse metabolic syndrome. Okay, it decreases triglycerides, it improves HDL, and it increases LDL size, decreases fasting blood glucose, and it decreases postprandial insulin and blood pressure. You know, like, how can you go wrong? Okay. Now, as we talk about protein, it has all these other effects, but I really want you to be able to get the muscle effects. And the way to get the muscle effects from protein is through balancing meal distribution. Currently, Americans typically have an unbalanced protein distribution. They say, oh, I had 2 eggs for breakfast, and then I had some Swiss cheese and some turkey for lunch, and then I had a big steak dinner. Okay, well, if you do that, you're in for a surprise, and it's called skinny fat surprise. What really needs to happen is you need to balance your protein distribution throughout the day so that when, as you remember, I talked about mTOR, so that you actually stimulate mTOR. So as you age, the body becomes resistant. The nutrient sensing becomes less robust. So in order to overcompensate for that diminished ability for that response, you need to hit a minimum, of 30 grams of protein per meal. Really, probably would be maxed out at 50 grams per meal. And, you know, I was trained by Dr. Donald Lehman, who, you know, really invented the science. He's one of the first pioneers. So, you know, my perception is very skewed seeing this for 2 decades. So really getting, you don't have to have 3 meals a day, but when you have your meals, I definitely recommend more than 1 meal a day to actually stimulate that tissue. And if you're looking for body composition changes, 3 meals a day works fantastic in a time compressed window. Okay, so you're like, Dr. G, well, why 30 grams? I'm about to tell you. So hold on to your horses. Well, it is based on the branched chain amino acid leucine, which is one of the essential amino acids. And when you get this in the correct amount, it triggers and stimulates that mTOR mechanism. And that is at around 30 grams of protein. And that's why it's this meal threshold. So you hit this 30 grams of protein, which is roughly 2.5 grams of leucine, and then you stimulate mTOR. So it's kind of like being pregnant or not. You either are or you're not. It's not kind of in between, right? So you either stimulate this synthesis or you don't. Okay, so this is what really happens. But we're not going to talk about all the things that really happen. I just want to highlight this because this is a very complex mechanism. So this is the cell, and this is the insulin receptor, right? So the insulin receptor also goes down here, right, and stimulates mTOR, and this is through the Reb and all these other mechanisms. But leucine also stimulates mTOR. Both drive muscle protein synthesis. Now, arguably, you'd be much better off if you just focus on the leucine for muscle protein synthesis, okay? But both carbohydrates and protein stimulate mTOR. And that's where a lot of the controversy comes in about how protein is bad for you. I'm here to tell you that it is not. It is very beneficial to stimulate mTOR for muscle protein synthesis because this is your organ of longevity. Okay. So at the end of the day, you really have to protect your muscle at all costs because, you know, we flux throughout the day in a catabolic, anabolic state, right? And what happens here is if you are sub-threshold and not getting enough protein, you will never, if this line is muscle protein synthesis, you will not stimulate that tissue. So you will go throughout your whole day not stimulating this tissue. Then you'll get one big bolus at dinner, and then you'll actually get muscle protein synthesis. This is not a good strategy if you want to protect your tissue. You really want to balance muscle protein breakdown with muscle protein synthesis. It is all about protecting this tissue. 30 to 50 grams of high quality animal-based protein per meal. There's a ton of data out there that supports this, especially as it relates to the leucine threshold. I put this out here because this really shows the difference between young tissue and aging tissue. I know they say elderly, but replace that with overweight, obese tissue. It's not just elderly that have this anabolic resistance or this impaired tissue. And really what this shows here is that, so this is 28% leucine meal, about 1.7 grams, whoops. But what it really shows is that when you increase that dose of protein, you can get a robust response to overcome almost any tissue, whether it's an obese tissue or an elderly tissue. Getting that minimum of 30 grams per meal and hitting that threshold can make this aging tissue look like young tissue. So really the whole point of this is that leucine is necessary for stimulation of tissue, and you can overcome the response of anabolic resistance, which is that inability to stimulate mTOR, if you get a robust, enough protein per meal. Okay, quality matters. This just really rubs me the wrong way. When I saw that movie Game Changers and people actually believed the entertainment as science, just blew my mind. So beef is one of my favorite sources of protein. You can see here in a 3-ounce serving, you get 50% of your protein. You know, as it relates to the RDA or the daily value rather, daily value. It gives you almost 50% of your B12, zinc, selenium. I mean, you can read here. It's really amazing and a nutrient dense source of protein versus, so here you've got beef for, this is about 4 ounces of beef. You get 183 calories, 2.5 grams of leucine, 30 grams of protein. Quinoa, you need about 6 cups. You'll get 2.5 grams of leucine, but because it's lower quality, that you're actually consuming 42 grams of protein, but the calories are 1,100. So yeah, that's metabolically devastating. And then chickpea, tofu, you can see, so it's the quality of the protein that matters, and then it coincides with excess carbohydrates. Okay, so what does 25 grams of protein look like? Well, 3 cups of quinoa. And again, this is a lower quality protein. Not excited about that. 6.5 tablespoons of peanut butter, which is about 600 calories for 25 grams. You know, I want to point something out. So this is 25 grams and 25 grams, but cut that in half because of the lower quality of the protein. The amino acids are much lower. But I just wanted to highlight this in a visual for you. So, and this is all as it relates to 3 ounces of beef. And you can exchange beef with lamb or any red meat, you know. You could even exchange it with chicken as it relates to the quality of the protein. So the big picture of understanding protein is that you determine how many grams per day you want to have. And that is 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. I was responsible here and I included the RDA. I don't believe it and I don't think that you should either. I only think that you should believe it if you want to barely get by. This is the current recommendations for endurance athletes and strength athletes. However, I will tell you that I believe it should be 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. So number 1, you get your grams per meal. Number 2, your grams per day. Number 2, grams per meal. Grams per meal, you just divide it how many times you want to eat. You can easily go above 50 grams. A minimum is 30. So you adjust the total grams per day and then divide that into what you want per meal. All right, so at the end of the day, if you really want to fuel smarter, you combined high quality protein with resistance exercise, and man, you are doing yourself a massive favor. So over here, this was just interesting. This compared different qualities of protein and exercise. And you can see here that exercise, so this is exercise and this is rest. This is with 20 grams of protein. This is rest and soy ingestion, which doesn't do anything for muscle tissue. And then this is rest and weigh, as you can see. So FSR is really just, it relates to muscle protein synthesis. It's just the synthesis rate. And then you can see here, so it really just, eventually relates to muscle protein synthesis and muscle hypertrophy, over a period of time in theory. The exercise and soy have the same response as whey, protein, and rest at 20 grams. So that's interesting. And then with exercise and whey, you get a robust response that it actually equates to 40 grams of protein. So this simply means that if you want to consume less protein, then you must resistance train. So you resistance train and then eat your protein. It's a cumulative effect, okay? But if you have more protein, so if you look over here, this is exercise and whey. If you have more protein, combine that with resistance training, you get an even more robust effect. So I think that's very valuable when it comes to maintainable strategies. Okay. So other ways to optimize muscle tissue and really understanding the truth about protein and the concept of muscle-centric medicine is if, you combined both resistance exercise and dietary protein. Again, this is 20 grams of protein versus 40. So at 20 grams of dietary protein plus exercise, it will give you the same robust response as 40 grams of protein at rest. So if you're young, you can get away with less protein, but as you age, you really need to increase the amount and the training. Okay. So people ask me this a lot, alternative ways to increase muscle protein synthesis. If you are vegan or vegetarian, you could add in branched chain amino acid. I don't recommend the supplementation of leucine alone. You should utilize all branched chain amino acids together, leucine, isoleucine, and valine. So what about the mature athlete? Well, that's my dad. This is getting into more specifics, and really it's anchoring that first meal and the last meal with the guys. So, a minimum of 30 grams and a minimum of 30 grams. Really, the aging population needs more. All right. So we've got to redefine dietary protein. You should eat with a purpose, and that purpose is obviously calories, the building blocks for new proteins, but also metabolic signaling. And that is the big picture of understanding mTOR, muscle protein synthesis, is you are redefining why and how you are eating dietary protein. So the practical application is a minimum of 3 meals. And I shouldn't say a minimum of 3 meals. It should be a minimum of 30 grams per meal. Ideally, 3 meals is good. If you want to really stimulate your tissue, that's really where the data shows, but you can increase that. Or decrease that depending on what your personal preference is. Each meal lasts, each robust response lasts between 4 and 5 hours. Exercise, this is really in summary, exercise will lower the amount of protein needed for MPS. And this goes for both older and younger athletes. The optimal muscle protein effect for mature athletes is a minimum of 30 grams. Again, younger people can get away with less, but a higher amount for those aging. Lower quality protein can be augmented by adding branched chain amino acids. So think in terms of meal distribution. All right, so you guys got this. You can find me on my Instagram, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. If you want more of this, I do offer more courses that go in more depth. You can sign up for my newsletter and my YouTube channel at Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and of course my website at the same name. Hope you guys have a great day.